Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Want to welcome everyone. This is session 3 of How to Fight Racism, using the book by Jamar Tisby of that same title. And today we're going to be focusing on how to explore your racial identity. The video is about just under 19 minutes long, so not quite as long as last week. So it should give us a lot of time to have a discussion afterwards about the material that we'll be watching. Just want to remind you, when we have conversation, you can either raise your actual hand, virtual hand in your window, or you can use the little prompt hand in the corner of your window. But if you go down to the bottom panel, you'll see the reactions and you can raise that as well. And that's helpful because it actually moves your square to the upper left-hand corner of my screen, and then I won't miss you. Although it looks like today we'll all fit on one screen, so I think we should be good. If you see someone's hand raised and I am not seeing them, just unmute and let me know so we can hear from everybody who would like to share their thoughts, questions, or concerns. Most of the time it is helpful, as you all are doing, is to mute. So thank you very much. That will prevent any background noises from distracting us or making the camera jump around. We've been going a little longer than an hour for these classes, but if you do need to jump off at any time, that's fine. Not a problem. We'll try to wrap up around 20 of quarter of. And if some of you would like to stay on longer and continue a conversation, we certainly can do that. And let me, if there are no questions, let me open us with a word of prayer. Will you join me in prayer? Holy and gracious God, we thank you for gathering us today, even if it's virtually, that we might better understand our part in fighting racism. We do lament the ways that we have failed to see the full humanity of all your children. Continue to open our hearts and minds so we can speak truth to power and help to establish your kingdom of justice and peace here on earth as we know it is in heaven. We pray all this in Christ's holy name. Amen. So just as we get started, a little review. I think most of you have been on, this is our 3rd week. So is there anything from the first 2 weeks that you want to mention, or as you've been pondering this through this past week, anything in particular from last week that you want to mention? We are still in the awareness stage. So we're using this arc for racial justice, which is awareness, relationships, commitments. So this week, as well as next week, is still part of that awareness. And I think as white people, most of us on here white, that's really one of the most significant pieces for us right now, is to learn and to understand and greater awareness. Yes, Bob Bell.
Doesn't have anything directly to do with the course, but last evening, Jean and I and her sister Katie here saw the movie Harriet. And if you haven't seen it, I urge seeing it someplace. It just reminds you of the horrible history we have and the fortitude of Harriet Tubman. Unbelievable, very striking, very emotional. I commend it, and it was good background for what we're doing here.
Thank you, Bob. That's very helpful. And I know from last week there was curiosity and a desire to learn more about Black theologians and theologians of color. So I think towards the end of this series, we will put together some sort of a document. So you would have recommended books, movies, videos, podcasts, so other opportunities to learn in this area. And then I just want to remind you about the 21-day race equity challenge that we did last June. Lots of resources within that too. So we could, again, make that accessible to all of you and share the link so you can find that information. Anything else? Yeah, Nick.
Just 2 quick points. John had asked when he was teaching the class if we could think of a white person who is a good role model for not being racist. And interestingly, nobody mentioned Jesus. Now, it may be because we don't think of him as being fully white. I don't know. But certainly Jesus is one of the most inclusive people you can come across, whether we're talking about different races or women or anything. So I just wanted to make that point, that there is Jesus is a good role model.
Yes, Jesus is always a good role model for us, no matter what we're talking about.
Right.
Yes, in the stories that we read about Jesus in the different accounts in the Bible, Jesus always reaching out to bring people back into relationship with community, and he does that by, breaking certain societal norms, whether it's with women or with lepers or tax collectors or sinners, whoever that might be. Always, extending himself out to the margins, to those who are outcast, and bringing them, restoring them into relationship. Mm-hmm.
And one other point I wanted to make, and I think Paul might have said it, but it kind of got short thrift, and that was sports has been out in front in our country in actually taking down racial barriers. If you think that Jackie Robinson, got into the majors in 1947, and after him, there was another player, I forget his name now. But one of the great stories about breaking that racial divide was there was a coach named Don Haskins who was a player, and then he coached in the NBA. And he decided in his later years to coach a small team from Texas called the University of Texas at El Paso. And that team was all black, except they had one white player. And against all odds, they made it to the NCAA final against Kentucky. And Kentucky, of course, had an all-white team, and some players that went on, like Pat Riley and a couple others, Louis Dampier, to the NBA. They're a powerhouse team. And he decided then in that championship game not to play his one white player and only play his black players against Adolph Ruff's team, because he knew Ruff was somewhat a racist, and he believed 5 black guys can never beat 5 white guys. And of course, the story is that they won the championship, the University of Texas at El Paso. So sports has been in the forefront, I think, a lot of times. Jesse Owens, in Berlin, of setting a tone for our society, in some ways a good tone, showing that whether you're black or white, or you're Mexican or you're Hispanic, whatever you are, you can be a great athlete and you can be a champion, regardless of the color of your skin.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. One of the things Jamar Tisby will talk about today is that racism equates to prejudice plus power. So when someone has the authority to set those boundaries and can decide who's in and who's out, who can play, who can't, that's when we get into issues of racism. So if there are any other comments, anything that's been surprising you or on your heart through this past week that you'd like to share before we dive into this session. Okay, well, let's go forward. So today, as I mentioned, we're looking at our racial identity development. So this idea that it's not static, we can continue to grow and to learn and become more aware. And for all of us who are gathered on this Zoom call, I think that's why we're here. We want to be part of this conversation, part of this learning experience, so that we can kind of progress, move forward, and Jamar will talk about that and share this model of stages. So from stage 1 to stage 5. And as we become more racially aware about our own identity and how that interacts with the culture around us and with individuals that we know. So some of the key ideas for this video that we'll see in a moment, that each of us either has been, continues to be constructing these ideas about what it means to either be a white person or a person of color in our very race-conscious society. And as he encourages us to be more aware of our racial identity, he stresses that it's really important because it gives us a vocabulary for talking about it and for understanding it so that the awareness can continue to grow. And then as we understand our own identity development, it enables us to be in conversation with others and with the community at large. He'll give an example in the video that's really interesting. And I know I have had this experience in my life, is this idea that, the white people don't have a culture. It's like, well, there's all these other cultures out there. And we assume because we are the dominant culture in the United States, it gets normalized. So it becomes the standard. So it's like a fish in water. We don't even recognize all of these things that are playing upon us because we are the dominant culture if our skin is white. And then that he also wants to stress, though, that race is not your only identity, that, we're also sons and daughters, mothers, sisters, all kinds of other things come into play beyond racial and ethnic and cultural backgrounds. I kind of touched on this, but the significance of today's session is that increasing our awareness and our vocabulary allows us to interact with others and then have productive conversations about race, which I think is why we're all on this Zoom call right now. We want to learn more, understand more, so that we can be part of the solution of having productive conversations in our country that reduce racism. And then some of the things that he'll take us through in this session is understanding your racial identity development, and then also taking time to write down your racial autobiography. And he really stresses that take the time in the coming week to write it down, some answers to questions. So he'll give us some prompts through the video. And for those of you who have the book, you'll find it in the book. That it really helps us to understand our history and our identity as we talk about race. So any questions before we watch the video? All right, was that a question? It runs about just under 19 minutes. So I will share my screen and hopefully we'll be able to watch that. And let me know if you're not seeing it.
In 2019, I had the privilege of visiting South Africa and hearing from Black Christians there. We were at a church when a young Black Christian woman named Teboho shared her testimony. She spoke with a tone of bewilderment as she shared what had happened to her. In 2015, the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, announced a fee or tuition increase of 10.5%. Now, this increase made the cost of getting an education there prohibitive for many people, especially Black people. And in the wake of this fee increase came the Fees Must Fall movement. Now, Christians from across the racial and ethnic spectrum weighed in on this movement. Some came out in support of the protesters. Other Christians, especially white Christians, saw the movement as divisive and confrontational and even violent. And in the midst of all of this, as Teboho was seeing the response of Black Christians, she said this. She said, "For the first time, I realized that my brothers and sisters in Christ, when it came to this issue, we were not on the same page. I still did not have the vocabulary for it." Teboho went on to explain that she had first learned the Christian faith through the ministry of predominantly white Christian churches and traditions. And so these were her friends, her spiritual brothers and sisters, fellow members of the household of God. But when it came to racial justice issues, she found that she often had more in common with people who professed no religion at all than those who did. She said this, "It was interesting that you could relate more to those who do not confess the faith than those who did. Even the white people who were not Christian somewhat got it. They understood the injustice in access to education. And so for Toboho, this initiated a process of re-examining her faith, re-examining her social reality, and it left her in a temporary state of confusion as she developed the vocabulary to explain what she was going through. She said this: "So for me at this stage, it's a healing process and a lamenting and a repenting, and also realizing that how the Bible is taught is important." Now, Toboho's story has been repeated countless times in different ways as people of color, especially Black Christians, figure out what it means to be both Black and Christian at the same time. In other words, as they figure out what it means to embrace the fullness of being made in the image and likeness of God. An essential understanding for this section is called racial identity development. As we think about the story of Toboho, what she was doing was engaging in a process of awareness. And so this concept of racial identity development comes from psychologists. I'm especially drawing on the work of Beverly Daniel Tatum and her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?, where she outlines this process of racial identity development in several stages. This is a model that was originally developed by a man named William Cross in 1971 to explain Black racial identity development. And there are various stages that one goes through. And basically, you go from a stage of limited awareness or colorblindness into a state of greater racial awareness and a positive sense of self-identity, as well as respect for others. Now, this model is vital, it's helpful. I came across it in college, and it helped me to make sense of what I was experiencing in terms of a racial awakening. And I think for all of us, as we continue down this journey toward racial justice, it's important to locate ourselves in these racial identity development models so that we have the vocabulary that we need to understand what we're going through and to continue progressing through stages toward greater maturity on racial justice. So we've talked about the essential understanding for racial identity development. Now, your first racial justice practice is to actually locate where you are in terms of racial and cultural identity development. So this is critical because we have to locate or place ourselves in this process so we know what we're going through. And like Toboho said, she struggled to have the vocabulary, to have the words to describe her struggle to understand what was happening in her life at that moment. And in a similar way, we might all struggle to understand what we're going through unless we have the language around it. So I think that's where this racial identity development model comes in handy. Most of us can point to a moment or a series of moments of racial awakenings. Some people call it wokeness. This is true for Black people, other people of color, and white people. It's critical for white people to understand that they have been enculturated into race as well. In other words, they have a racial identity as well, and it's not just Black people and other people of color. I think of the story of Daniel Hill, who's a pastor in Chicago. Daniel Hill was at the wedding of his friend who was of Indian descent, and so he had all of these cultural artifacts and traditions from his heritage at the wedding. And Daniel went to the wedding, and he was so taken aback, he was so mesmerized at the beauty of this different culture that he said this to his friend. He said, "You have such an amazing culture. I wish I had a culture too." His friend said, "Daniel, you may be white, but make no mistake, you have culture too." In saying Daniel had culture, it was also meaning that Daniel's culture was created and crafted in the context of race and his white racial identity. And that moment, Hill later explained, was an awakening for him. It helped him to become aware of his racial identity and set him on a journey to greater and greater racial awareness, to the point now where Daniel is an ally and an advocate for Black people and other people of color in this journey toward racial justice. As I mentioned before, racial identity development involves a process of going from less racial understanding to greater racial understanding, and there are hiccups along the way. There was a white man who was quoted in a study saying this: "If you apply for a job, they seem to give the Blacks the first crack at it. And he said, basically, you know, if you want any help from the government, if you're white, you don't get it. If you're black, you do get it. What this man was essentially communicating was the idea of reverse racism, or that now that society has moved further in their racial awareness, that white people were being unfairly discriminated against. And I just want to address this concept of reverse racism for a moment. So it is true that people of any race or ethnicity can act in prejudiced ways toward other people and other people groups. They can even do it based on race or skin color. But what is crucial to understand about race is that it is a system of power, that it is a system of advantage based on race. Again, borrowing from Beverly Daniel Tatum, another way to understand race is as prejudice plus power. Let's take economics and politics as we talk about this concept of reverse racism, so-called. Let me just read you some statistics. So in 2018, about 40% of people identified as racial or ethnic minorities. As of 2019, just 4 of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies were black. Only 11 were Latinos. The story is much the same when you look at boards of directors. 16% of those on boards of directors were racial or ethnic minorities. Then in politics, in 2018, Sharice Davids of Kansas and Deborah Haaland of New Mexico became the first 2 Native American women elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. No African American has served in the U.S. Senate in the South until 2013, when Tim Scott of South Carolina was elected to the U.S. Senate. So the deployment of this erroneous concept of reverse racism is a sign that people have much further to go in their racial identity development and their understanding of the concept of race. Locating yourself on this racial identity development model doesn't mean that race is your only identity. We are sons and daughters and brothers and sisters. We are workers and church members and people of faith. There's a lot more to us than just our racial identity. What racial identity development helps us to do, though, is have a healthy understanding of our racial, ethnic, and cultural background for ourselves and also for how we relate to other people. Another racial justice practice for exploring your racial identity is to explore your racial autobiography. So we have this genre of literature called the slave narrative. These are enslaved Black people who wrote about their experiences under slavery and as Black people in America. And they were helpful because they revealed a side of life that other people, particularly folks in the North or white people, hadn't been exposed to before. And by telling their stories, they created the necessary agitation to work for emancipation and abolition. They created greater awareness by talking about their own journeys of race. In a similar way, we in the present day need to explore our own stories of race. I think one of the reasons we struggle to talk about race in general and we struggle to fight racism is because we haven't come to terms with our own racial stories. And so exploring your racial autobiography is a way of doing that. Now, I would encourage you strongly to actually write this story down. It doesn't have to be shown to anyone else, but writing it down is a way to help you process thoroughly and holistically your racial journey. It'll help you put words to what you've experienced. How can you start to write this? Well, try a few of these questions and just answer them in writing. For instance, what is your earliest memory of race? Have I had any negative experiences associated with my racial identity or that of someone else? When did I start growing racially conscious? When was my moment or series of awakenings? And here's another one. From whom or in what period of life did I learn the most about my racial identity? Those are just a few prompts to get you going. But in exploring our own racial autobiography, we are released to be honest about where we are, about the progress we've made, and about the progress we have yet to make. It can be very hard to reflect on your own racial autobiography. There are going to be perhaps some very painful moments there. But I like what famed author Joan Didion had to say. She said, "I think we are all well advised to keep on nodding terms with the people we used to be, whether we find them attractive company or not." I think those are wise words. Who we have been before is not necessarily who we are now or who we will be in the future, but it is important to remember our own stories when it pertains to race so that we can locate ourselves in terms of racial identity and move forward. Another racial justice practice to employ is exploring your family's racial identity. So there's a system in therapy called family systems therapy, and it's based on the idea that who we are as individuals is formed and shaped by our whole family. And so it looks at communities of people, small communities. And in a very real sense, exploring our own racial identity would be incomplete unless we also explore our own family's racial identity. Now, be warned, this can be very difficult. For white folks, you may discover some things in your family's history, some beliefs that people hold, some actions that they took that may make you feel feelings of guilt or shame. But this is important to explore for your own development and for confronting a past that maybe needs confronting in your own family. For Black people and people of color, this can also be very difficult because it can bring up memories of oppression, marginalization, discrimination, and racism, memories that people aren't eager to relive or revisit. But this is important as we come to grips. How can we come to grips with racism in our society if we won't come to grips with racism in our own families? So how do we do this? Number one, be honest about your purpose. Tell whoever you're talking to, a parent, a sibling, a grandparent, that you are on a journey, that you are trying to become more racially aware, and you just want to know some more background about what your family has been through, how you were raised, and the context that shaped you. Let them know your purpose. Another crucial racial justice practice is teaching your kids about race. So the first step in talking to kids about race is educating yourself about race as an adult. How can you teach what you don't know? The second step is to push through your fears. I mean, we all have these questions. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I say too much or too little? Is it age appropriate? You're gonna have to do it. And that leads to the next thing that we need to remember in talking to kids about race. Do it early, do it often. I think one of the things that helps alleviate the pressure of talking about race is realizing that we don't get just one shot to do it, that this is part of an ongoing conversation. And you can give it in little bits and pieces, and if you don't say the thing exactly the right way or in exactly the right terms, well, you can always have another conversation about it. The other thing we should remember is that we can't just tell kids, we have to show kids. So I'm a big fan of going to places and giving tangible interactions with our racial history. And so you can go to a museum, you can go to a geographic spot where some important aspect of racial history happened, or it can take place through multimedia. You can use children's movies or books as ways to springboard into a conversation on race. You can even use the arc of racial justice to sort of pattern your conversations. How do you build awareness for your kids about race and ethnicity? How do you help them intentionally build relationships across racial and ethnic lines? How can you show them that race operates according to systems, policies, and procedures, and show them ways that they can be a force to fight against racism? The only wrong conversation to have with your kids about race is the one you don't have at all. One final racial justice practice about developing our racial identity operates on the systemic level, and it's this: create a pipeline of Black mental health therapists, or therapists of color in general. What I mean by this is the mental health care profession is predominantly white, just like many other professions. According to an article in Psychology Today, it says that racial and ethnic minorities represent 40% of the population, but 83.6% of mental health professionals identify as non-Hispanic whites. That means if I have a mental health issue that has to do with race, Most of the time, I'm having to talk about it with a white person. Despite their best intentions and desires to help, there's a gap if you haven't experienced racism as a Black person or a person of color. There's also a gap in training. Many mental health professionals are pushing for more culturally aware, culturally responsive practices, even in the schooling and the credentialing and the training of mental health therapists. What if we were able to create a pipeline of Black and people of color to be therapists? What if we were to invest in scholarships or programs or organizations and associations that could provide mentorship, financial support, and encouragement for people of color and Black people to become mental health professionals? This would be of benefit not only to Black people and racial and ethnic minorities, but to all people, as mental health professionals are able to bring their lived experiences and perspectives to bear on mental health in general. Many people assume that they've already settled on ideas of race and racism, how it affects them. But we have to be contemplative. We have to be self-reflective about our own racial experiences, our family's racial experiences, about the kind of help and therapy we get when it comes to our racial experiences. And it's only by taking a conscious look at our history, our identity, our racial autobiography that we can progress in terms of our racial awareness and journey further down this road of racial justice.
So you can kind of see where he's going with today's lesson about how to develop your racial, cultural identity. And he's given us 5 racial practices that we can discuss more about. But first, did anything stand out to you from his teachings today about developing your racial identity? Anything surprised you? Yeah, Sue Kelly.
One point that I thought was very helpful to me was the idea of nodding to our old selves. And hopefully there is an old self to nod to and move on, and the never-ending story of continuing to move on. So that resonated with me.
Thank you. Yes, it's helpful to remember where we've come from as we are really intentional about this growing awareness and moving kind of into the next stage, to not like totally forget how far we have come on that journey. Yeah, thanks, Sue. Others? Yes, Kathy.
Yeah, something that he said was disturbing to me, but I have found it to be true in a sad way. At the beginning of his talk, he mentioned that that Black people could relate more in their struggle to non-Christians. Non-Christians seem to get their struggle, and were less hurtful. And so, you know, that's sad, and you wonder why. And then he mentioned something about it's important to realize that how the Bible is taught, you know, makes a big difference in people's race, seeing race, yeah, appropriately.
Yes, amen. And boy, is that an understatement.
I know.
How the Bible is taught is really important. Yes, and that connects back to last week's session when he was discussing the image of God, that no matter what our skin color, you know, male or female, we are all created in the image of God. But sadly, yes, a lot of Christians are taught something different. And then that's where that disconnect comes into play, where she was able to be more understood and could, you know, resonate better with people who were not people of faith, even though she had grown up in, you know, a Christian community. Yeah, it was a struggle. So that was the story out of South Africa to Boho. And, you know, the tuition went up, and that was really an issue of justice as far as access to education. And I see Ernie or Gabrielle's hand up. Yes.
I thought one of his important points is that we as whites need to recognize that we indeed have a culture. And that's one we take so for granted. As you said earlier, we're the fish that doesn't recognize the water we're swimming in. When we lived in Nigeria, we became very conscious that we were from a different culture than the people all around us. And one of the things I found most striking about how dominant white, i.e. Western culture was, that the Africans referred to African Americans with the same term, which roughly translates as skinless ones, as they did for those of us who were white. You know, that the Western culture is so distinct that in the Africans' eyes, African Americans were part of that culture, not their culture.
Yes, that's very helpful. And as Ernie's pointing out, what happens because whiteness is the dominant culture in the United States is that other people who immigrate to the United States begin to kind of adopt and assimilate and kind of, you know, go along to get along with the dominant culture. Because that feels, you know, in some ways easier than standing out. So some of the issues that we take for granted is, you know, our approach to time. That if you go on a mission trip, often when, you know, worship is going to start in the morning sometime, you know, it's not that worship starts at 9 a.m. There's a very different understanding of time in other cultures. And this punctuality is very much an aspect of our white culture, or what we come to think of as, well, it's just what we do in the United States. But that's because we have the dominant viewpoint of whiteness in our country. Another is the work ethic, you know, just this kind of Protestant, you know, you just pull yourselves up from the bootstraps, you're an individual, you don't need the support of your community. That is very alien to other cultures, but very much part of our whiteness. So you can see there are all these things, and I can send you a list. It's just fascinating. You know, you can break it down into status and power, issues of justice, our holidays, all of that. I think in my lifetime, you know, more holidays have been put in to our calendar to recognize that not all of us are Christian, Protestant, you know, European people of white color. So trying to recognize that our culture is dominant, and how do we honor other people's cultures. And that was that illustration of Daniel Hill, a pastor who went to a friend's Indian wedding and was like, oh, it would be so great to have a culture. But we do, we just don't recognize that we have this white culture because it's been so normalized. So I don't know, has anyone else had an experience like that? What was, yes, Carol.
I remember with the kids when the teachers would, like a social studies section, they'd say, okay, bring, you know, a meal from your family's ethnic background. And I truly I don't feel like I have one other than Donna Reed and Father Knows Best. We don't identify as anything other than American. Like as far as food, it's whatever came out in Better Homes and Gardens that month. That's what we would do, the decorations, whatever. It was very, you know, sort of generic culture. So it always used to annoy me when they'd say, well, bring food in that's your typical culture. I'm like, so what is that, mac and cheese? You know, I always got annoyed with teachers that would say, write up your family's background. And, you know, first of all, I'm adopted. I have no idea where I came from. I always thought I was Mexican, which is pretty funny. But I seriously did. Then found out I was Finnish. So, you know, doing Cinco de Mayo with strudel. I don't know. I just feel very that the whole culture thing I sort of bristle about.
Thank you. Yeah, and Don Lincoln put in tuna casserole in the chat there. But yes, food is a perfect example about kind of the whiteness becoming the dominant culture, and we don't even know. Well, I don't know what would be a meal that would be represent my culture. Okay, and Carolyn and Paul, you have a comment. Thanks.
Yes, Paul and I moved to New Mexico. Mind you, I grew up outside of Philadelphia. I didn't have much Hispanic influence in my life. And when we got there, I was driving around trying to learn Santa Fe and couldn't pronounce the street names because they were Spanish. And I'd ask for directions and I couldn't get it because they spoke Spanish and I didn't. And I just felt like, this is my country. Why can't I get around in this city? Then we went to a museum and I saw the history of the people who I was interacting with, and I felt so very arrogant. It was a big lesson and it really turned me around. It doesn't relate the same to being in a Black community, but it is the same.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Yes, language is very important part of our culture. And again, the sense of being the white English as the dominant language in this country. Yeah. Other thoughts?
And I think when I've been traveling overseas and I'm with acquaintances who are upset that not everybody in this country speaks English, and they're equally upset when we're in France or Germany or Italy and the people there don't speak English. And it's like, really?
Well, it's a good example that our white expectations go with us, wherever we go, there they are again. Yeah, great example. Other thoughts? As you start thinking about your racial identity autobiography, think back to what was your earliest experience of race. And you can ponder that, but if you have one that you'd like to share with the group, that would be fine as well. Was there a time that stands out to you when there was a significant shift in understanding or something that shocked or disturbed you about what you encountered in the world around you or with your family? Yes, Paul, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I grew up in Sacramento, California. Our first house was the northern part of the city, very white neighborhood. There were no African Americans. I don't even think there were Latinos in our elementary school. But my parents decided to move downtown. Nice area, but the school was very segregated and very integrated, Latinos, Asians, African Americans in both my junior high and my high school. And that was a big shift. It's a big shift to go to an area where you encountered that, and everyone at school had their own stories. And it was a great move. It was a great move for my parents to move to this new house and expose us to that. And I think that's one of the reasons they did it, was because they didn't like the area we were growing up with. It wasn't a version of it.
Thank you. And that's something that Jamar Tisby points out, is that as you're trying to teach your children, and don't have to think about this as the next generation under your or grandchildren, nieces, nephews, but children in general within Westminster's congregation, in your neighborhood, your community, if you are a teacher, is to share with the next generation how they can be advocates for racial justice. And part of that is to give them concrete examples. So, just the words about, the stages and development and your identity, that's not going to relate with children. But boy, if, you do what Paul's family did and you move them somewhere else where they're being white is not the dominant experience, that is a learning experience and quite a lesson. So Paul, thanks for sharing that. Has anyone else had experiences like that? Yeah, Betsy.
when I had my second COVID shot, I'm exhausted.
Oh, take it easy.
I
Drink a
wanna-
lot of water.
Yeah, you're right. I want to relate this. Anyway, when I was a child, I grew up in Bryn Mawr. Okay, now you're talking, 70 some years ago on the main line, which is extremely white, except for the service people who came out on the PNW to clean houses and stuff like that. And my father had a dear friend, Jack Koch, who was an African-American man and who painted, and they needed some work done. So Jack came out and he was painting probably the window frames and all that. My little friend and I, who were 4 years old, he was so sweet to us and kind to us and caring to us and listened to us as children, which who did that? And he was just wonderful. And we, in talking to him, my little friend and I called him the chocolate man. Now, I'll tell you what, I love chocolate. So this was an endearing description of him. And when I got to be an adult and actually was having my daughter, who is 42 now, Jack came out and painted her room for her, the nursery. And so we kept up with him all these years. And he related that story to me. He remembered that we called him the chocolate man. And it was just, I've always felt that way. It's just a wonderful thing. And of course, now I have a lot of chocolate people in my family and I'm so happy.
Thanks, Betsy. It's a great story. And Ernie, did I see your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to share our family experience, particularly focusing on my mother that grew up in northern Wisconsin, totally white community. We lived in a white section of town in southern Wisconsin as I was growing up. And then eventually one of my nieces married an African American. And my mother had the biggest struggle, and to reconcile her belief that, yes, God created everyone. Because I think that, at probably age 65 or 70, her first real face-to-face personal experience of a Black person and how to accept him as into the family, because she loved her niece. And yet this was such a huge jump for a person of her generation to have an African American in her previously all white family.
Thank you. Another good story to share. And that kind of takes us into this model that Jamar shared during the video, which is the 5 stages of racial identity development. And when you have an experience like that, it can shift you from a lower stage to a higher stage. So if you reflect on it, and as he says, if you're contemplative about this experience that may not be a comfortable one, but it's an opportunity for God to work in that discomfort to move us along to greater awareness of racial identity for ourselves and how we relate with other people in the world. So any other comments? And if not, I'll share a slide I created with those stages. So you can kind of take a look at that, and then we'll talk about the stage and you being challenged to identify where you are in those 5 stages. And then as we continue on in this series of how might you engage in relationships or make commitments that would help to move you along in this journey. So I will share my screen again, and let's see here.
Call on Beth, Ann.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see. I'm trying to get this screen up. Are you seeing the slide?
Yes.
Okay, so racial cultural identity development, and these are the 5 stages that he shared in the video. Stage 1 is conformity, So I think that describes it well, where you're conforming to what the general understanding is in the United States. Stage 2 is dissonance and appreciation. So something has happened that, as Ernie was describing, there's some event that creates this dissonance, and you begin to appreciate that there are other ways of thinking about race and about your own identity. And then resistance and immersion. So you may either resist that opportunity to move forward on this journey, or you may immerse yourself in more opportunities for understanding. And then the introspection stage 4, which is, that just collecting information, reading, watching videos, the movie Harriet that was mentioned earlier, as we reflect and pray and contemplate what we're experiencing in our racial identity. And then integrative awareness, where we can become part of the solution. We can be an advocate for racial justice. So I will, and I can send that to you through Realm. Okay, so let me see here. I'll stop that. Sorry. Okay, and I gather, Beth, you had something you wanted to share?
Okay. I was just thinking about, I guess, first, I guess, racial awareness. It was kind of hard for me in a sense because I've always lived in mixed areas from the time we were young. And I might have mentioned this in the previous study that we had. We moved into an area when I was maybe like 2 in Philadelphia, and we were the second Black family on the street. And everybody, even a block over, were white. So I kind of grew up culturally mixed, and there were a lot of Jewish people in the area. And but in a 10-year period of time, you saw with white flight from the city to the suburbs, a lot of the white people left the neighborhood. And I do remember my mom saying, because it would be like, where did this person go? Or where did this person go? Oh, they moved, they went somewhere else. And, it was the turnover as to why all these people were moving. And, I can kind of see it in both ways. Sometimes, at least how things are now, people want a bigger house, even here in the suburbs. So they're going to move to where they can maybe have land, as in those days, as opposed to in the city. However, the part I lived in the city, we lived in row houses, but there were a lot of houses that had their own land and in-ground pools and things like that, just a few blocks away, because I lived right over the city line. And later, my parents even moved to Paoli, and it was the same sense. We were the first Black family in the neighborhood there. They moved because of the strikes in the city. That the schools would go on strike, and the teachers would be out of the classroom. And one time it was almost Halloween before we went back to school. And that was when I was in 5th grade. And my dad said, I had enough of these teachers striking every 2 years and things like that. So that's when we moved to Paoli, because my dad was working in Berwyn already. So, and he was commuting from Philadelphia. And we lived the other end of the main line in Paoli. And I went to school in Great Valley. And we were there for about 3 years, and then we moved to Westchester. And it was still that neighborhood we moved to here in Westchester was outside of the borough, and not like near the borough. It was really out if anybody's familiar with South 5 Points Road, and I guess between Westtown Road and Route 3. There's like a neighborhood midway between there, off on South 5 Points. That's where we lived. And when we moved to that neighborhood, there were about 3 other Black families in that neighborhood, and the schools were pretty well integrated at that time. I had heard they just gone through a desegregation of the elementary schools at that time, and They were pretty well mixed. They had closed a lot of the elementary schools here in Westchester in the borough. They were older buildings in disrepair, but up until that time, I heard that they were segregated, mainly because of the area that the kids lived in, all near there. But then there were some that they just had all the Black kids went to the Gay Street School, which is now the what is that? The borough hall, or the business municipal building for the borough of Westchester on Gay and Adams Street. That was the Gay Street School, and that's where all the Black kids went, because there was a guy that he was 82, and that was probably like 7 or 8 years ago, and he was telling us that, that's how that was then. So they had just desegregated all the schools in Westchester, and I went to East, and it was a pretty good mix of students. But I came into this session today a little late, and I came in just a few minutes before Jamar Tisby was talking about somebody's book about why are all the Black kids sitting at the same lunch table. And in Westchester, when I moved here, we happen to have friends that we met in our neighborhood, and we would, kind of gravitate toward them because we hadn't met a lot of new people yet. So if we had the same lunch with them, we would sit with the friends they'd sit at and sit with. And here, without really noticing until you really thought about it, we were sitting with all the Black kids at the same table. And some of the things had to do with things that we could relate to all together, even if it was racism, but that usually wasn't just a thing. It was just other people that knew people that knew people. And we kind of, I guess, segregated ourselves like that. But I had white friends everywhere that I lived. And, I'm glad I came up culturally like that. But there were times that there were, differences shown, or things that we learned from, white flight. That was a major thing in all the cities here in the United States. So those were my first things of racism. And then when I was young, and I don't know how young, but I know we were living in Philadelphia, I noticed that there were no Black people on TV, commercials or anything. And I think I asked my mom, but I can't remember the answer that she gave.
That has gotten better over the years, I think. Right. But yeah, you touch on some really important topics, Beth. So one is, the redlining that was going on in this country, where people of color were prevented from moving into certain neighborhoods. And that because our public school system is based largely on where you live geographically and paying your taxes, that affects where students were going to school as well. So you kind of have all of that whole domino effect. The book that you mentioned, and I have not read it yet. I don't know if anyone else has read that. Ann McNally, maybe you can give us a little synopsis. It's by Beverly Daniel Tatum, written in 2017. So why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? And Ann, do you remember it well enough to give us a little synopsis of what she covers?
If I recall, it's about a 400-page book. So okay. There's a lot to remember. But I will tell you that my takeaways, one, she was at one point the president of Spelman College. Two, it's probably the best researched book that you're ever going to read on racism. It's incredible. If you want to do research, start with her book, look at her bibliography, and you'll get a lot of references. And I think a lot of it, well, Beth, I can't speak to your experience, but I get the fact, I can imagine the fact that it's about having lunch with friends who share your culture. Because the more I'm learning about racism, it's about culture. And I mean, a lot of people have talked about it today. So, I've got one other thing while I've got the floor, and then I'm going to be quiet for the rest of the session. Going back to racial experiences, the one that drove it home for me, when I was going to Drexel, I would take the subway back out to 69th Street and 69th Street bus. And there were two buses. I lived in Broomall. There were two buses, one that took you to Newtown Square and one that took you to Westchester. If I got the Newtown Square bus, everybody on the bus was white. If I got the Westchester bus, half of the bus was black. And I had never really thought about it because Marple Newtown was a lily white school and I always lived in white neighborhoods. But that Westchester bus, that's when I started to see black people in numbers that took me out of my comfort zone. So it was a real awakening.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Anne. And those are the experiences that Jamar is pointing to and wanting us to, reflect on and to think back, or even as we continue on in life, is to pay attention to them and ask those questions about, well, why is it? Why is this bus, mostly all white people and this bus isn't? And that can push us into some of those experiences of dissonance and questioning, and then an opportunity for greater racial identity awareness. Any other comments about what we've been talking about so far? Yeah, Carol.
Just to share an incident when I was 10 or 11 years old, so long time ago. I grew up in the panhandle of Texas and went to the orthodontist in Amarillo, which had a beautiful department store. And, they had like the models would come through and show you what the clothes were. My entire town, I think, was white. We had a smattering of Native Americans and a smattering of Latinas, but everyone I knew was white. And shopped in this department store, which was lovely. And somehow I'd gotten off on my own. I guess by 10 or 11, you kind of wander away from your family. And I needed to use the restroom and went into a door marked women, and I'm pretty sure it said women, but I didn't read the rest of it, which was the rest of the signage, until I entered the restroom. Now not Black and Decker, whatever this department store was elegant, lovely. There was the women's bathroom had like chaise lounges to recline and rest while, if you got tired of shopping, like turquoise and blue, everything was just elegant, wallpaper, furniture. And I opened this bathroom door by mistake and it was brown. I can't tell you how, there was no color, no nothing. It was just walls. I think there was maybe a chair. And I started to go in because the floor plan was the same. I recognized the floor plan. I knew to go left into the stalls and was stopped. And they were like, "Oh, honey, you don't belong in here." And, there several women came and ushered me out. And I realized the bathroom said colored women. And it completely blew me away because it was such a huge shock to see how different, like it just never dawned on me that there was a difference, that they would have, like now it's employee restroom and, regular restroom, but then it was colored and then the other women. And it was profoundly impactful on me because it was just so startling how different they were treated.
Yes, and that brings up a really significant point of United States racial identity, is this idea that separate but equal. But if it's separate, it is not equal. So that was total misnomer that you could have any segregation and still have equality. But people like to say, oh yes, we have a separate bathroom here, and they're equal. But no, that's not the reality of when you start to segregate and separate people, that it's not equal. So hopefully, yes, Beth.
I just wanted to say something else. There is a book, and I can't remember the author's name. I think the illustrator is Quillman, but it's called Walking the East End and Walking the Uptown. There's two books, and they had maps because there were tours at one time, and it's of Westchester. And it shows the east end of Westchester in the borough where a lot of Blacks lived and was industrialized. And it talks about the business. And this is like from some of this stuff starts in the late 1800s. Some of the things I found it very repetitious, even between the two books, even in the one book, but it gives you a little bit of insight on the area at the time. And at that time on up, they went up into the 70s, and it wasn't necessarily in order. So, you know, there was a Black pharmacy. There was, and not meaning a Black pharmacy, it was a Black owned pharmacist.
But
You know,
that's
and I remember
helpful.
a lot of the places that they mentioned. So it's that, and then there's places on the main line that were always pockets where African Americans lived. And, you know, in Paoli, it was an area like not too far from the train station. There was another area in Berwyn also. And on down. I know there's a section in Wayne, and there were Black churches and things like that. So there have been historically, you know, at least even since the 1800s, Blacks in certain areas, even on the main line. And it might have been people who came in as servants at one time, but there were also people that owned their own businesses and things like that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, you're right. I mean, up and down the main line, there are remnants of that, about, you know, where people were permitted to live and where they weren't. But thank you for sharing those books. I think it is really important to better understand local history. And also, I want to commend to you, once it opens again, is the National African American Museum History in DC. It is a fantastic learning experience. It's very powerful and disturbing in many ways, but it's important to go and to continue to educate ourselves so that we can increase our awareness.
Right, I haven't been there yet. My sons were there. They went with the schools because at one time it was hard to get in, and you had a certain time frame and things like that. And it'll probably be like that now after COVID anyway.
And they reopen, they'll probably have to limit capacity in some way.
But that's on my list of
good.
places to go soon.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal museum. Well, I'm aware of our time, so I do want to touch on some of your homework for this week, if you want to delve into it. So that the first one of his racial justice practice is to locate where you are on that development chart. So, and I will send that out. So there are those 5 stages, and you're to, you know, be prayerfully reflective about where you are. And then as you think about locating yourself, is then, you know, think about what were some of the experiences that you had, relationships, any events in your life that maybe moved you to the next stage and then the next, and what can we be attentive to going forward to what might help us to move from where we are forward on the journey. The other opportunity you have is to explore your racial autobiography. And again, Jamar thinks it's really key to write it down. And I will send you some of those prompts that he gave you. So to think about what is your earliest memory of race. And some of you shared about that. So thank you very much, because I think it's in the sharing in community like that, that it helps to jog our one another's memories. We're like, oh yeah, I had something not identical, but oh yeah, there was this person who was really important to me, who was a person of color. Or, that's right, we did move and this was a different experience. Or I took a bus and had this, I noticed this about them. So that really helps to share in community, I think. And have you had any negative experiences associated with your racial identity or that of someone else? And I think sometimes if we're being attentive and aware of people around us, that we will notice something happening to somebody else. And it will be very disturbing and upsetting. And that will, if we are reflective about it in our own lives, will help us to question that, to maybe push back against what we see happening. Whether it was redlining, segregation of schools, we have moved a lot. We've made progress in our country, but there's still a long way for us to go. So how can we, as people who are trying to advocate for racial justice, how can we be more attentive to the things that are still not just and wrong? That how do we move forward to more equality and justice and those practices that recognize the image of God in all people? And then is to kind of think about, be reflective about what concerns you about your racial past, but then also what encourages you, to have parents who would take the initiative to move you from an area that's mostly white and you're the dominant culture out of that comfort zone into an area where you're not the dominant culture any longer. And then the significance of exploring our family's identity. And Jamar Tisby talked about family systems therapy. And as you learn about counseling and therapy, is that we are, as individuals, we are formed by our family systems. So we're born into these families, to parents, and who are human beings themselves, but we are from the earliest, the longest, and the most intimately shaped by those relationships. So you need to be reflective about, well, what was going on in my family? What was their racial understanding? And then you'll have other generations impacting, grandparents. I can think in my own life, just the shifts that have happened from my grandparents to my parents to my generation, and then to the next generation, is about how we would understand our racial identity and how we would try to interact with others. And then the fourth one was teaching children about race. And that, of course, is educating yourself first, and do it often, and do it repetitively. So you don't have to worry that, you have one shot at it. That's not the case. You continue to share with children, and in very concrete examples if you can. So it is getting the book out, watching the movie, going to the museum with the next generation. And he did talk about using the arc of racial justice model as we talk, not only with kids, but with one another. So this idea of the awareness, relationships, and then the commitments that we make to continue on this journey. And then what I thought was interesting was the last practice for racial justice was mental health professionals who are people of color. So recognizing that when you have dysfunction in a family system or in a community system, that we need therapists to enter into those relationships as a source of healing, a source of awareness and understanding. But if that is a white person going into a system of people of color, you can see already there's dissonance there, and that's not going to work as well as it could if that's a person of color who can empathize and better understand their experience in the United States, which is a dominant white culture. So something for Westminster, I think, to think about is how might we support those students that want to become counselors and therapists who are people of color. So I will send out some of those prompts and the 5 racial justice practices that you're encouraged to do this week, although you can continue working on them as much as you want. And then next week, Jenny picks up, it's session 4, and it's how to study the history of race. So before we close up, any closing comments about anything you feel challenged by or curious about, any surprises? Are you all eager to write your autobiography? Who thinks they're going to attempt it? Are you going to sit down? Some paper, some prompts? Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I started it because I'm doing this group, the same book study with another group, and we're on chapter 6 already. So we did this chapter, and instead of writing our stories, our autobiographies, we just shared. There were only 6 of us. So we just went around the Zoom group and shared our earliest memories of race. And what disturbed us and what encouraged us and just things like that. We all had such different experiences. We all were white. Mine were the most disturbing to me. So think I want to explore it more because I was born and my family all lived down the eastern shore of Maryland, and it's very segregated. And so I was made aware at a really early age of segregation and why. I never understood it, and I constantly would ask questions and use the wrong bathrooms and things like that. And so I just remember being confused.
Mhm.
Like, and it felt wrong. It felt like this isn't right, you know? So yeah, it's good to explore.
Mhm.
It is. And I'm gonna explore it more.
Yeah, I think it is an ongoing practice. It's always a work in progress. Thanks, Kathy. And I think, we do recognize that something is wrong from a very early age, because racism, again, is prejudice plus power. So if you give someone or some institution the power, the authority to act on prejudice beliefs of who's in and who's out, and who can use which bathroom and go to which school, you can see that is going to feel unjust really quickly.
Mhm.
Other closing thoughts? It might be that, as you begin your autobiography and try to place yourself in one of those 5 stages, that it's having a conversation with someone in your family or a good friend, and it will be in talking about it that you'll be able to kind of jog your memory and then try to capture some of those stories and remembrances down on paper so that you can have them as you go forward on this journey. Anything else? Well, thank you all. Really appreciate you joining in and sharing. It's such a blessing to have other people on this journey with us. So grateful. Let me close us in prayer. Loving God, we are grateful that you create all of us in your image. We thank you for this community in which we can learn and grow in our understanding of racism. And we ask you to continue to reveal our blind spots, our places of misunderstanding about race, and do give us the courage to take an honest look at our racial identity. And we thank you for guiding us to be more intentional about our journeys towards racial justice. Help us to be part of the solution of repair and repentance and reconciliation. We pray in your name. Amen. Well, join in next week, 11:30, again on Zoom, and Jenny will be here to lead us in that 4th session. So, blessings all.
Thanks, Anne.
You're very welcome. Thanks for coming and doing it twice, Kathy.
Yeah.
That must be really cool in different
I
groups.
have a lot to learn.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anne.
You're welcome. See you, Joni. Bye. See you, Nancy. Enjoy the day.